Hi, everybody. I am going to spend some time here giving you some notes about finalizing like the Great Awakening, and I want to talk to you about the Enlightenment, and then finally, like the political structures of England and how that translates into the United States. So we were talking last class about the Great Awakening, which I have a image here on the screen. You can see one of the preachers, perhaps it's Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield, and you have the congregants, the people of the town who are here to listen to the preacher. And remember, they're so moved, they cry, they shake, they faint based on what the grand itinerant or these other itinerant preachers are saying. And the reason that this is all really important, guys, is it encourages the colonists to kind of band together. So it gives them a common identity. Everybody's experiencing this religious revival, the change of their heart, right? And they are experiencing conversions and being reborn, and they're making this pact with God. And while they're doing that, it also encourages them to challenge the leaders of the town. Remember, New England towns are controlled by a minister. And the minister was at first saying, look, I'm the one who's experienced a conversion. I can try to help get a lot of you there, but most of you are not going to make it, and your souls will not be saved. Whereas this is asking questions, thinking, now, wait a second. I think that I might be able to be saved as well. How do I do it? Well, these preachers of the Great Awakening are saying, well, as long as you worship and you preach and you live a moral life and you try to work really hard, all of you can be saved. And it's a more uplifting message. And it starts to then make the colonists challenge the leaders of the communities. And you can see, like, once you start to challenge things, that's starting to sow the seeds to the revolution. After the Great Awakening, let's discuss the Enlightenment here. It's kind of a movement that's happening at the same time, simultaneously, to the Great Awakening. So, as the Great Awakening is this great religious revival, we have here the Enlightenment, which is another movement, but it's a movement based around changing your life. So, both of these movements are about changing your life, but the Enlightenment is about changing your life based on science and knowledge and information. So the idea that knowledge is power. The more we learn, the more we can adapt that to our lives, and then we can make changes for our lives for the better. So just like I said the other day, none of you are sitting there hoping that your life gets worse. I'm assuming you're all hoping that your life gets better. How are you hoping your life gets better? Well, you're going to try and identify problems and then make changes for the future. So the Enlightenment, unlike the Great Awakening, and that was focusing on your heart, the Enlightenment is focusing on your head, learning things, doing experiments, finding knowledge to solve problems. And one of these famous figures is Ben Franklin. He conducted scientific experiments about the laws of nature. That's how he figures out that lightning is driven by or a source of electricity, because he's willing to figure all of this out. I'm just going to move my face here over Ben Franklin's face so you can see. Really, the writers in the Enlightenment, these are thinkers who are traveling around Europe and the colonies, and they're asking questions and trying to discover things. And they're saying that tyranny, someone who's like a really oppressive ruler, shouldn't exist, and they value justice and equality, and they said these are given to you by God. And you see how that might sow the seeds of revolt as well. Why should we listen to what somebody else is telling us if we can be valued and be treated as equals? They're also saying they're calling for political change in terms of they don't want to be part of maybe the British empire anymore. They are looking for more rights, more voice, and their natural rights to be respected. One of the greatest Enlightenment thinkers, and I'm going to move my face again, his name is John Locke. And John Locke is one of the greatest influences on American government. He basically lays the foundation for the Declaration of Independence. And he, of course, he's not an American. He doesn't write the Declaration. But John Locke influenced Thomas Jefferson, who did write the Declaration of Independence. So John Locke's ideas are that we're all given these natural rights, that we are given rights by just being born as human beings, and those rights are your right to life. So just because you're born, You have the right to continue living, and nobody should be able to take that away from you. Whereas before the Enlightenment, you had all these tyrannical, oppressive rulers who said that God gave them the right to rule, and they had the opportunity to end your life whenever they saw fit. So if you posed a threat to a leader prior to the Enlightenment, the leader wanted to silence you, they'll off you and your family, as opposed to John Locke is saying nobody should be able to take that right to life away from you, not even a leader. Also, you have the right to liberty. You have freedoms. You can live your life by your own free will. And then you have the right to own property. Nobody should be able to take that away either. So it's in direct response to these people, these tyrants who are taking away rights and taking away freedoms and taking away people's lives, taking away property. John Locke is saying you have the right to all those things just because you're a human being. And it's people need to enter into what is called a social contract, an agreement with the government, and that people need to give up certain rights and liberties to the government in exchange for like protections. So that's how John Locke influences then the founding of the United States were based upon these ideas of inalienable rights, natural rights that can't be taken away. And when they are taken away or when they are infringed upon, it's the responsibility of the people to rise up and change the government. So he's literally talking about revolt. And all of these things are going to be referenced in the Declaration of Independence. Okay, this is really important because the Enlightenment really improves human beings and society, and it's giving people a way to control their lives and make their lives better. They also inspire colonists to ask questions and wonder and challenge the leaders. And as you can see, they're going to start to challenge the British government. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about the roots of American democracy here. We would, if I were in school today, we would certainly do this think, pair, share. We're going to skip this for now, talking to somebody else. But I do want you to think about it as we're working through here. What is a democracy? So go ahead and type the answer in on your Edpuzzle, and then I'll share an answer with you, and we can move on. Okay, so hopefully you typed something about democracy being that the people have power. The people have a say in, how their government should be run. The people have the political power. It's not like one leader gets the power from God. It's the people give leaders power through election. So why is government important? Go ahead and type that in your Edpuzzle. Okay, hopefully you added something in there about why government is important, based on the idea that we need some type of order and control. So if you think about people without government, like people in what would be called a state of nature, no government, a lot of you probably are thinking like it's going to be chaos, it'll be anarchy, it'll be dangerous, people will steal, people will hurt each other. There's probably validity in what you're saying. So a government is there to maintain order and to provide things for people that they might need. So then I really need you to type in what the role of the American government is. So think about it. What do you think the role of the American government should be? Or what is that role in your life today? And then because I can't really answer what you think the role of the American government should be, and everybody kind of sees the role of the American government differently, I'm just going to move on to the fourth question here that you're going to answer. It says, Locke believed that natural rights, those rights of life, liberty, and property, were important to protect. What other rights do you think are important? So go ahead and type in some rights in this Edpuzzle that you think are important to protect, and you'd be willing to fight to protect those rights. Okay, now that you've done some deep thinking, really, my face is in the way here. Oh, I can make it smaller. There we go. Okay, the rights of the Englishman. I want you to think about the rights that we have as Americans and where they actually came from. What you might be thinking of is that, England had a king and they didn't have any real rights. That's actually not true. Of all of the countries in Europe, England actually had the most advanced democracy. And sure, they had a king, and sure, the king was absolute power, but they also had a lot of ability to govern themselves. So the colonies in particular were able to have a lot of the like rights and liberties and freedoms of the English subjects, and actually more so because the colonies are all the way across the Atlantic. It was really hard for the British government to control everything that was going on in these colonies. So England gives basic rights for the British people at this point in time, and a lot of those basic rights were translated then into the American governing documents. So let's just talk about where those rights come from and what those might be. The first document that's really important in British history and actually in American history, if you want to trace it back that far, is the Magna Carta in 1215. So we're looking at the 13th century. So really, we're looking at almost 400 years before we were even discussing the American colonies. Something called the Magna Carta was created. And what was happening was the King of England, King John, in 1215, was really oppressive. He was taking away people's land just because he could. People were losing their right to life just because you might pose a threat to the king. You randomly would be assessed taxes that you couldn't afford. The Magna Carta is this document that was forced upon the king, and the king had to sign it, that said, just because you're the king doesn't mean you have absolute power. The king doesn't get to do whatever he wants, and he has to follow the laws of the land. This is translated directly to the United States today. We're a country of laws, not a country of men. And no person, no president, no member of Congress is above the law. And if you try to be above the law and you violate the law, even if you're in the ultimate position of power, you then will face those consequences. So the Magna Carta is this really important document that says, and is honored by the king, that says the king is not the law. They are a country of laws, and the king has to abide by those laws too. So here's what the Magna Carta basically says. It establishes that English people have certain liberties and rights. Those rights are that the property that they own can't be just randomly seized by the king. If you work hard and you own property in England, the king just can't take it away because he feels like it. But before 1215, he could. So this is a really big deal. You couldn't be taxed unless a council of prominent men agreed, and the council of prominent men are your governing bodies. So they couldn't just like randomly assess taxes to you or raise taxes. You really couldn't randomly be thrown in jail and executed anymore because a jury of your peers, a group of people just like you, had to agree that you deserved to be punished or deserved to be executed. And then the right to elect representatives to government. You get to choose who is determining whether you should have taxes. You get to choose who's making your local rules. And this is a really big deal in the 13th century. And you can see how this would pave the way for the creation of the United States. Okay, here's the Magna Carta, just in case you want to see it. It's in a museum in Britain. It is a beautiful document, and it's a really, really important document in human history. If you think about it, sorry guys, I know I always do that, but if you think about it, today there are countries who still do not have the rights that have been laid out by the Magna Carta in 1215. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about government structure. The first thing I want to make mention of is Parliament. Parliament is like the lawmaking body in England, and their Parliament was representative government. And this is how we get the idea for representative government. So, what is a representative? A representative is someone who is chosen to represent you or speak for you in government. So, like right now, we're doing student council elections. And in those student council elections, you're going to elect one representative from your homeroom who's going to speak on behalf of your entire homeroom. And that's what government officials do. And this idea comes from British Parliament. There were two houses in British Parliament, the House of Commons, which is the elected house. They're closer to the people. And if you owned land, you had a right to vote. And then you elected people to represent you in the House of Commons. And then there's the House of Lords. They are not elected officials, but they're very important people in Great Britain. Ultimately, Britain and Parliament had the ultimate authority over the colonies. However, what I do want to mention is the colonies they're across the Atlantic. So it was really hard for Parliament to impose all of their rules and ideas on the colonists. It's kind of like the colonists are kids who went away for college and they're pretty far away, so they're more difficult to control. Here's a document just to see how this works. You've got the House of Lords sending some people to Parliament. You've got the House of Commons sending some people to Parliament. And then Parliament and the Crown, the King or the Queen, were working together. Today, this is not necessarily what this looks like because the Crown is largely ceremonial in Great Britain. This would really then be the Prime Minister up there. But it was the King or Queen was enforcing the ordinances created by the Parliament, and the King and Queen got to tell Parliament what they wanted to see happen. Okay, let's just move on here. We've got Parliament versus colonial government. Because the colonies were so far away, self-government was allowed. The colonists were able to make a lot of their own choices because, they're pretty far away from Great Britain. So the colonies created all of these assemblies. Those are like the House of Burgesses. There's assemblies in like Rhode Island and Massachusetts. It's self-government. It's the colonists who came together. Maybe they were representatives and they were able to make decisions on what should happen in the colonies. It would address their own needs. However, sometimes the colonies created laws that ran contradictory to Parliament, and sometimes Parliament was angry at colonial assemblies and vice versa. And it creates this like really awkward relationship because a lot of times if Parliament was imposing a rule on the colonists that they disagreed with, they were going to get really upset at Parliament. So there's a lot of conflict that would occur. And then as the king tried to have more control over the colonies, he was sending royal governors, and the royal governors were trying to impose the will of Parliament, but the colonists wanted more freedoms and rights to control themselves. So you can see how a lot of tensions here are forming. Here we have in the mid 1600s, the colonies were ignoring England's laws like the Navigation Act. So the colonies were kind of like, yeah, you know what? Parliament is trying to impose these laws. They're kind of far away. Like, we're not going to enforce these ideas. And remember when we played that game, you guys were like smuggling as part of an effort to ignore the Navigation Acts? That clearly eventually is going to make Great Britain mad. So that's exactly what happened. King Charles II canceled that Massachusetts charter, which gave them the right to self-government, and it takes away all of their self-government. All of the assemblies in different Massachusetts towns were removed, and Massachusetts then fell directly under the king's control, and they imposed the royal governor in on Massachusetts. So Massachusetts had like a taste of freedom, and now the crown is trying to like start to control what the people in the colonies are doing. And if somebody started to try to like give you a lot of freedom and then they're really cracking down, they're trying to take those freedoms away, you can imagine how that might be received by you. So what ends up happening is King James I takes Massachusetts and all the other New England colonies like New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island and makes them all one, calls it the Dominion of New England, and then he puts a guy straight from Britain in charge named Edmund Andros. And he takes away all of their right to like self-government. He doesn't really allow town meetings to take place. And now all of the colonists get angry because they had all this taste of freedom, and now all of a sudden their freedom is taken away. They are like falling directly under the control of the British government. So the colonists are angry. They're going to start to refuse to pay their taxes, which is going to make Great Britain mad, obviously. At the same time, King James starts cracking down on people in England, taking their rights away. And eventually, things come to a head, and King James is actually overthrown. He has to flee England, and he's replaced by his own daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. And they were in the Netherlands, and they actually come and as part of what is called the Glorious Revolution, and they take the throne in England, and people celebrate the fact that William and Mary are in control, because then once King James is out, a lot of the rights that British people had and the colonists had are restored. So like peace is restored for a temporary time between the colonies and England. So in 1689, William and Mary, as part of this glorious revolution, they then signed what is called the English Bill of Rights. And perhaps this sounds familiar to you because we have a Bill of Rights included in the United States Constitution. But what the English Bill of Rights says here is that the monarch can't cancel laws, so they can't just override laws that exist. That would be like the president just saying, no, I'm not going to follow the laws that are created by Congress. He must follow the laws that are created by Congress. He can't impose taxes unless Parliament agrees on those taxes. There needs to be free elections and frequent meetings. So, like restoring the basis for democracy here in England. There were no excessive fines and cruel punishments that would be forbidden. And then the right to complain to the king or queen without being arrested. You have the right to speak freely. And even if that speech is unpopular or critical, you are still allowed to say it without being thrown in prison. So, this is the idea that laws are made by Parliament. The king and queen are not absolute in their power, and just because they might not like something doesn't mean they can take those rights away. And you can see a lot of this reflected in the United States today. So here we have rights then that are claimed by the colonists. The colonists say, well, if the Glorious Revolution happened and William and Mary are in charge, I most certainly want my rights restored as well. So they put Governor Andros in jail. They restore all of these New England colonies. Sorry, the announcements just went. What ends up happening here is that you can see like the tensions are eased because then you see here a colonial assembly is reestablished. This colonial assembly that's reestablished gives the rights of the colonists back, and they have a lot of authority over their own lives again. And then I just want to mention this to you. So we already alluded to free speech. We alluded to no cruel and unusual punishments or no excessive fines. Where does the idea for the free press come from? And the idea for the free press comes from like 1735. The colonists are going to start to move toward this free press. And what happened was it was really illegal to criticize the king in 1735 in print, and you'd be thrown in prison for it. So this publisher, Peter Zenger, he printed criticism about New York's governor who represented the king because he was a royal governor. If you remember back on this document here, there's a royal governor here who then reports to the British crown. This guy who was in charge of New York, he was criticized in a newspaper in New York, and Peter Zenger stood trial for printing that criticism. And then the reason that this is significant is Zenger wins his trial. It was agreed upon that Zenger was allowed to print that because people have the right to speak the truth, even if the king doesn't want to hear it. And this is how freedom of the press becomes an important new right in the United States. So at this point, you guys are going to summarize the roots of democracy based on the notes that have just been presented to you and the information that you just heard in the Ed puzzle. And I'm going to have you write your paragraph and make sure that you submit your paragraph to whoever is covering class today. Hopefully everything is well, and I will see you next week. Thank you.